So, if you couldn't tell, I'm very Irish. So today's going to be a little more lighthearted. I don't know, maybe I'm just in a good mood for the holiday weekend, but anyway, when it comes to Christian holidays, I'm sure a lot of people immediately think about Christmas, Easter, even Thanksgiving, the big ones that pretty much everybody celebrates. But one holiday people might not necessarily think to include in that list is good old St. Paddy's Day. A day to celebrate Irish heritage, culture, wear lots of green, and, unfortunately for a lot of people, drink lots and lots at cheap Irish pubs. But of course, the holiday itself is based in Christian history, based around the feast of St. Patrick, who indeed was a real 5th century saint for the Christian church. But yeah, let's first address that title of his, because while yeah, St. Patrick is indeed venerated as a saint within the Catholic Church, he's actually never officially been canonized by any pope, which is actually quite common for most church saints before the 10th century. Patrick himself was born around 385 AD and died most likely on March 17th, 461, which of course is the day we now celebrate him and his life. But because of how early his life falls within church history and the lack of an official canonization, there has really been a lot of debate and arguments regarding Patrick's Christian affiliation, with different groups claiming him as independent, Protestant, or of course traditionally Catholic. I would actually argue that none of these labels accurately describe him, though, since keep in mind this is around the 5th century, really only a few generations removed from the apostles and Jesus himself. This is still centuries before the Waldensians, the Anabaptists, or the Protestant movements began. So, yeah, calling Patrick a Catholic is just about the same as calling him a Christian at this early point in church history. At this time, the word Catholic was still much closer to its original roots, meaning the one universal church. The idea that the church more refers to the spiritual body of believers rather than the physical building. It's a pretty fundamental belief of Christianity these days, but keep in mind that coming off the back of Judaism, the idea that the physical building of the temple or tabernacle doesn't actually matter, that was still a pretty radical idea at the time. Anyway, another interesting tidbit about Patrick is that he actually wasn't Irish, but rather English, born somewhere in Great Britain, either England or Scotland. Patrick was born right around the same time that the Roman Empire ended its rule in England, around 385 AD. But of course, the influence of the church and Christianity was still massively prevalent in both his family and culture. According to his own words growing up, Patrick himself wasn't really that dedicated of a believer, despite having such a strong Christian upbringing. This, of course, changed when Patrick was 16, where at his family's villa, he was captured and enslaved by Irish pirates. Patrick was then shipped over to Ireland to be sold into slavery, where he was held captive for 6 years. He worked as a shepherd in Ireland, and as is the case with most Christians, during his darkest hour he turned to Christ in prayer, rededicating his life to the Lord in the time that he served as a slave. Eventually, according to his own autobiographical works, the Lord led him to flee Ireland by ship, eventually making it back home to Britain as a young man in his 20s. But Patrick believed that God had a calling for him, and despite his captivity and enslavement, he had a heart for the Irish people to hear the gospel. See, Ireland was one of the few areas of Europe not really touched by the Roman Empire, and as such, they never experienced the major influence of Christianity or the gospel. But this all changed when, a few years later, Patrick would indeed return to Ireland as a missionary, attempting to reach the primarily pagan culture. Of course, with all mission trips, he experienced a decent bit of backlash from the local religious beliefs at first. But despite this, Patrick's ministry would actually go on to be incredibly successful, reaching thousands with the gospel, including everyone from the rural farmers and slave traders to the ruling class and elites. In 432 AD, he officially established the very first Christian church in Ireland in County Down. At first, it was nothing but a small, rundown barn that eventually came to be known as Saul Monastery and functioned as a sort of hub for Patrick's missionary work. Patrick's time as a slave would prove to be quite helpful. Having been accustomed to Irish culture, he was able to reach the public using metaphors and messages that spoke to their traditional religions and beliefs. Of course, one of the most famous examples is him using a shamrock as a picture of the Trinity, 3 leaves representing the 3 beings as one Godhead. These days, the shamrock, or clover, has gone on to be the universal symbol for Irish culture as a whole, and I think that really speaks to just how massive the influence of Patrick's ministry was. Even after his death around 461, Ireland continued to be dominated primarily by Christianity, and still remains the most prominent religion in the country to this day. I myself feel like I have a pretty strong connection to St. Patrick, not just, of course, through genealogy and Irish heritage, but also in the area I grew up in. And if you grew up in the southern United States, odds are you're pretty heavily influenced by him too, whether you're aware of it or not. The southeastern United States and southern culture as a whole has very strong foundational roots in Scots-Irish immigrants who immigrated to the Appalachian Mountains. The influence is pretty apparent in the strong Christian base that most southern life has, the Appalachian dialect being relatively close to Scots-Irish if you get deep enough south, and even bluegrass music and country genre as a whole has very strong ties to Celtic music. Anyway, when talking about St. Patrick, I just think it's really impactful because he was such a strong missionary and clearly cared about the Irish people so much, but these were the people who enslaved him, who kept him away from his family, held him captive for years out of his life. Yet he didn't turn to hatred or revenge, but rather he realized that he was one who was simply lucky enough to be blessed to find the Lord, and he wanted to share that blessing with others. And I think you see that with a lot of the great missionaries throughout history, where even though they're ridiculed, even though they're exposed to hate and persecution, they don't care because they want to share God's love with others. They see a people in need and they want to be ministers to them. So today's going to be a little more lighthearted. Thunder, stop. Shut up. So anyways, today is going to be a little more lighthearted.